The question we want to look at with this virtual lecture is, what roles did imperialism, immigration, and journalism play in shaping the food industry at the beginning of the 20th century? In this first part, we're going to look at imperialism. To do this, the history teacher in me wants to start off by looking at an 1872 painting by John Gast called American Progress. John Gast was an immigrant to the United States living in Brooklyn at the time he painted American Progress in 1872. At the center of the painting, we find Columbia, also known as Lady Columbia, a historical and poetic figure used to represent the spirit of America. Her use in this context was replaced by that of the Statue of Liberty around 1920. Here we see her advancing from right to left, or more precisely, from east to west over untamed land. The emblem she wears on her forehead is that of the Star of the Empire, which represents American progress. In her right hand, she carries a school book, often discussed as representing intellectual advancement through education and even enlightenment. From her right elbow, she carries telegraph wire, hanging to be clutched in her left hand before connecting to poles. The wire serves as a symbol at the time of technological advancement. Perhaps one could perceive this use of this angelic figure as an extension of peace and innocence. We will revisit this as we look at early 20th century food advertising later in the course. To the right, we find civilization with what appears to be tall ships delivering or importing goods. Perhaps we see evidence of the spice trade. We see smaller ships deliver produce and foods and supplies down the Mississippi River to markets and industry. From there, we see steam engine trains carrying goods to new markets in the West. Along the bottom and center, we find settlers on the outskirts of civilization. The farmers and landowners cultivate the land for a future harvest. Meanwhile, people and commerce continue west via Pony Express, Wells Fargo wagon, overland stagecoach, covered wagons, railroad lines, and on foot or horseback. In its simplest of form, this painting is showing manifest destiny, the precursor, if you will, to imperialism. Manifest destiny was not simply westward expansion, but a widely held 19th century belief that settlers had a God-given right for expansion throughout the entire continent. As we move our attention to the left or west, we find perhaps desperate signs of loss and change. Native Americans and animals, such as bison and bear, flee from progress. We get a sense of how Euro-American dominance over the land and resources strips traditional and even cultural use of the land once used freely for hunting and gathering. Indigenous people, animals, and even vegetation in the wilderness had no option but to be driven out to make way for cash crops and the growing extension of civilization. The last area to focus our attention on is this contrast between the civilized East and the untamed West. Of particular note is the simple, almost ominous warning of hard times and dark clouds ahead. While Gast's painting captures the spirit of progress shortly before the turn of the 20th century, perhaps it also serves as a warning about the advancements and decisions we continue to make throughout the 20th century and beyond. Political, legal, industrial, scientific, economical, and social. I thought it was important for us to look at this painting because it not only serves as a time capsule, but in a way, this one image allows us to travel through time and look at the idea of imperialism in its earliest roots. Before we go any further, let's first define imperialism. Imperialism is defined as the policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion of a nation through gaining territorial acquisitions, gaining indirect control over the life of other areas, political or economical. Broadly speaking, imperialism is the extension or imposition of power, authority, or influence. In terms of expansion beyond the continent, the U.S. first engaged in some purchases and annexations. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. For that purchase, we got just over 586,000 square miles, which works out to roughly 2 cents per acre. That same year, the U.S. annexed the Midway Islands. In 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii. What was the motivation for the annexation of Hawaii? Economics. Decades earlier, American settlers built sugar and pineapple plantations, including Dole, on Hawaii. In 1883, American plantation owners and the United States Marine Corps overthrew the Hawaiian Queen. By the start of the 20th century, Hawaii had become one of our greatest sources of sugar. So, why imperialism and why now? Well, at this time, the United States was an industrial power. With electricity, we had new ways of manufacturing. We had new industries such as oil, steel, and canned foods. We also had a growing labor force in expanding urban areas. There were growing economic forces and needs, such as supply, our resources. The growth of these new industries demanded greater and more reliable sources of products. There was also demand, or the market. These new territories meant new markets. Also, America's population increase expanded domestic markets for food. We'll talk more about these economic terms later. Finally, transportation. Railroads and ships moved people and product into markets across the nation and beyond. Of course, both of these forces, supply and demand, benefited from advancements in transportation. Now let's look at some quick political support for imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century. The first thing we want to look at is the Monroe Doctrine. In the early 19th century, while we were still growing as a nation, Americans recognized that the imperialism seen by other countries could have a major impact on the Western Hemisphere. During his 1832 State of the Union address, President James Monroe, he stated that further efforts by European nations to colonize land or interfere with states in North or South America would be viewed as acts of aggression requiring U.S. intervention. It would be almost 20 years before legislators referred to this statement as a doctrine. Regardless of its name, the Monroe Doctrine set the stage for American foreign policy. And later, at the beginning of the 20th century, another president would interpret it greatly. Let's also look at the Roosevelt Corollary of 1904. Teddy Roosevelt was seen as an ardent supporter of imperialism. In fact, he strongly supported the acquisition of the Philippines during his presidential campaign. In office, he built upon the Monroe Doctrine by stating that the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the U.S. to the exercise of an international police power. Essentially, this gave the U.S. president the right to use military force to keep European countries out of Latin America. From 1906 to 1924, U.S. presidents used this to justify U.S. intervention in Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. Imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century can also be tied to America's involvement in several other events at the time. One is the Spanish-American War, specifically America's 1898 intervention in Cuba's War of Independence from Spain, which also had an influence from the yellow journalism at the time. We'll talk about that later. Then there was the Great White Fleet. This was Teddy Roosevelt's 1907 to 1909 worldwide publicity stunt. Well, he didn't actually go, but he sent a fleet of 16 brand new modern battleships circumnavigating the globe and stopping at exotic ports along the way. This was his attempt to do a couple things. One, he wanted to persuade the world that he had the military might and that we as a nation had the military strength and the technology to be able to protect our new territories and economic interests. Along the way, he also wanted to persuade the American public that we needed a Pacific Navy fleet. The last event we want to talk about is the Panama Canal. So in 1904, President Roosevelt made the decision that the United States should take over the long-stalled project to build the canal across Panama. The project actually began construction in 1881. And even after we took over, it wouldn't be until 1914 that the first ships actually crossed through the canal. Once the project was completed, ships were able to travel much more quickly from the East Coast to the West Coast, thus bypassing the need to navigate all the way around the bottom of South America. We've looked at a lot of things at the beginning of the 19th century and even a little bit before. Next up, in the second part of this video, we're going to look at the roles that immigration played in the American food industry.